I'm Donna Dodson. I'm the curator of Interpreting the Natural, Contemporary Visions of Scholars' Rocks at the Korean Cultural Center. I'm a sculptor, an independent curator, a freelance writer, and a public artist. I'm also a visiting scholar this year at Brandeis University. As an artist curator, my inspiration for this show was Takashi Murakami, his Little Boy show that he presented at the Japan Society in 2005 was revelatory for me, thinking about the culture of post-World War II Japan as it was translated and seen through the eyes of contemporary artists and in Japan's art and pop culture. For this exhibition, I've brought together 10 contemporary artists to help me understand Chinese scholars' rocks or Korean viewing stones and Japanese suiseki. I think everyone can relate to finding a unique stone on the beach and bringing it home. The aesthetic of these rocks and these oddly shaped stones speak to really fundamental ideas about collecting and curating contemporary art. And I see them as a relevant lens through which we can think about contemporary art. The artists in this show use a variety of media, which I've brought together. Due to COVID-19, we'll have a robust virtual programming series, which you can access through the website, koreanculture.org or interpretingthenatural.blogspot.com. I hope you'll join us online to share your impressions of the show, to ask questions, to meet the artists, and to engage with us in this discussion. Traditionally, scholars' rocks, or susak or suiseki, are carved by wind and water. They're often described as the bones of the earth because they reveal what's left behind, the geological structure that's the hardest to break down. And thinking about those in a social context or political context, I think we could read into them that they stand in for truth or more fundamental concepts. Movies such as Parasite brought scholars' rocks to a mainstream conversation. I don't think many people were all that familiar with scholars' rocks, besides artists. And as we watch the world be torn apart by climate change and social unrest and our divisive political life, I think scholars' rocks speak to us in this moment. And I hope you'll enjoy this exhibition. Thank you.
I started this because of process, mostly because of walking around here where I live. There's a waterfall very close to where I live, and a creek and a gorge that's formed by the water. So in seeing it every day, I just became fascinated by the interaction and the interconnectivity of the water and the landforms. I saw some scholars' rocks at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I looked at them and I just wondered how I could bring that kind of sculptural connection that seemed so much about landscape and about geology and how things were formed, how I could bring those together into my sculptures. I felt like I was taking this, little detail of the landscape, and it was starting to show everything about how the geology of the landscape was formed. So I did it in paper for a while, and now I'm trying it with clay. And it's a process of working with it in slab-like form, rolling out very thin layers as if it's paper, and then going in and manipulating it and carving it and cutting down and building up until I get the form the way I want it to. I originally approached art through painting. That was what I love color. I love working with color. I love the spatial effects of color, that you can kind of change a flat surface by where you put color, the push and pull of it. I love to mix the glazes as I paint them on, as I would paint, and then be surprised at how they come. My work has always been on a very small scale. When you come in close, they seem to become much bigger, and then it's reflected in those larger geological changes that are evident in the landscape around us. When I look at rocks and I look at the the marks on them and the remnants of where they came from in terms of you know, how they'd been scored by glaciers or, you know, pushed from one area to another. They reflect time.
I think what intrigues me about Scholars Rocks is it almost goes back to dolmen stones, just these ancient stones that people would meditate. It brings us back to our primal roots. I like the fact that there's some human interaction with the stone, but there's also just the natural occurrence. To me, Scholars Rocks are a microcosm of things that happen in the ocean, brain coral, seaweed, microcosms, macrocosms, the cosmos. You know, it's really sort of a trigger for nature. It even starts to lead me into architecture, to rogue bees' nest, to all kinds of things that occur. I think I naturally was just interested in this interaction between man and nature, humans and nature. That I got a grant and traveled to Japan and Korea, and I went to look at gardens, ceramics, architecture, and dance. So I looked at a lot of rock gardens, and that was an influence. And I was showed early in my career at the Allen Stone Gallery, and one of the artists I showed with was Richard Rosenblum, who was collecting Scholars Rocks and very articulate human being. So it's a combination of all of that really got me interested in Scholar Rocks. And just and more than just Scholar Rocks, just this interplay between humans and nature. And I mean, as Jackson Pollock says, we are nature. Like at the moment, there's a big makers movement, and I've always been a maker. But it's a pushback against how much time we spend in this sort of virtual space, and we need this primal experience. And there's something especially about sculpture that's very physical that people respond to. I think what attracts me to the shape of Scholar Rocks is, and I find this, you know, even starting with my ceramics, I like to push the clay so that it does what's natural and unpredictable. That's what attracts me to the forms of Scholar Rocks, because they take all kinds of forms, really. Some are crazy intricate, some are simpler, but I think I like it when they're the most natural and there's the most surprise and the most unexpected.
Rocks is always super important, I feel like, in the Chinese culture, and I grew up have a lot of Scholar Rocks at home too. My dad was just like watering these sometimes, almost feels like a plant. And then somehow you feel when you have a Scholar Rock at home, you feel like it brings you this calm energy. Every time when I go to beach or go to forest or go to anywhere, I would just collect a small bag of stone. And I just loved how this could fit into my hand. But I also find one thing super interesting is like how at the very beginning when they start appreciating the Scholar Rocks, they are just like purely like, you know, finding that as calm and also spiritual, and then they writing poem based on different rocks they selected. But then I think towards Ming and Qing dynasty, because people start like objectifying Scholar Rock, and then they commodify the Scholar Rock, and then they start selling them in the market, and then that become like a totally different culture. And I just found the history of that part is super fascinating to me. That's why I really like to do this kind of show, because it's like totally out of my comfort zone, and it's not something like I would think usually. That just like push me to read and to research and to do this. I mean, like when you really think about commodification of Scholar Rocks, and that's where the, you know, like there's the base for the rocks coming, and they would just think they want to complete this thing by providing like a perfect base for these. And then there are all these very abstract shapes, but they somehow served as metaphor, as like they read meanings into this abstract object. and they see somehow themselves in this object too. So like it's a totally reflective of your own inner side. As like when you are looking at like a blank canvas, then what do you have within yourself? You could read that on this white paper. And that's exactly the same as when you're reading the Scholar Rock. It's like, I feel I'm being trapped. And then when you look at the stone, you feel like it's being trapped. And then, you know, it's like always exactly what's going on within yourself. Yeah.
Scholar's Rock is like just a moment of this incredible world, and it's just capturing that moment. The other thing that really grabs me about these is the sculptural quality, the three-dimensional quality, the incredible flow paired up with the simplicity of balance. MFA in Boston has this incredible Scholar's Rock, a giant one. It's just sitting outside the museum right there on Huntington Ave. And for years, I guess I never paid any attention, but one time I just walked off the sidewalk to it going, what is this thing? Realizing that this was a natural form, then it just started to really mean a lot more for me. And so then I started to look for them, and where I try to make my own artwork that kind of revolves around those ideas. Like I feel like it has to have a sense of the Western or a sense of the contemporary, almost a mixture of East and West. And there I feel like I have a role that is legitimate. The pieces that I have made that are constructed around that concept of the Scholar's Rock have been a couple different approaches. I mean, this is more of a constructed idea where there's no happenstance whatsoever, right? And then there's a whole other approach. You know, I'm making movements, but I have no idea what the final piece looks like until it's revealed from the mold. You know, stone for me is that material that holds this sense of awe. You know, we see these rocks that are, just don't pay any attention to them, but they really are these markers of history. And, you know, ultimately they're about movement, you know, whether it's movement, whether them being created, or movement as they're transported through various means throughout the world and the landscape. You know, we always think of the rock as this thing that's just stationary, but in actuality they're constantly on the go. They just move typically a lot slower than we do.
The wall pieces, the images are direct representation of minerals in Harvard Natural History Museum. So actually I made this series of sculptures called Minerals in Use. They are small sculptures that I made. They are fictional minerals, imaginary minerals, that are all made out of daily objects like toilet paper, kitty litter, or box tape, all these cheap daily materials. And that work was inspired by mineral collection in natural history museums. So I am very familiar with collecting rocks that looks like some landscape, looks like some animal, you know. You know, there is such a idea of sampling in Scholar's Rock, you know, how we kind of extract this portion of nature and bring it into our domestic settings. I think it's relevant to what I'm interested in, how we are sampling like little bit of wilderness or nature. So that kind of interpretation part is something that I have been interested in for the recent few years. So for example, like these minerals, I go look at the minerals in the natural history museums, I'm looking at these crystals and I'm looking at these different structures of aluminum and silicon, and I don't recognize them because they look so different than how I know them in my life. And I think, oh, these look like cotton actually, or these look like some rubber, or these look like, you know, some wax. Like that is totally not what they are, but that is my world. Like actually everything, like all of our materials are extracted from nature, and they are all somewhere in the world. They are being mined, they are being excavated, you know, in such a massive scale. And how we use it in our life, it's so convenient. We don't see how it is being extracted, collected, and dug out and everything.
Having lived in Asia, the influences are sort of percolate over time and show up in funny ways. Quite a number of years ago, my stepson and husband and I were on a hike, and my stepson found this little rock that was quite beautiful, and he let me borrow it, and I started kind of sculpting from it, and it created these hanging pieces that I made first out of plywood and then later acrylic, and then the idea of scale, because I was putting these little figures on it, but then it sort of spoke to a different, like an architectural scale. So that idea of the scale shift of this smaller object that might represent this larger, you know, immense landscape. A lot of my work seems to suggest something between architecture and landscape, some kind of hybrid of that. And it's interesting to me how the natural world sometimes, or what we think of as the natural world, is often a hybrid of meddling, you know, of preening, of kind of cultivating or organizing. I always think of, like, with the work and the architectural, I was making these communities where they were involved in this utopian project. And I thought of this arc of the utopian project, which there was always an arc kind of starting with great intentions. And the intentions are often that we will have a life of the mind, we'll be able to make our work, we'll be able to write or to create artwork. And then the dysfunction of an organization goes bad. You know, the Scholar's Rock, there's this idea of, oh, transport and spirituality and wonderful. And then it's interesting to me to make it with this, like, there's hair extensions on it, and there's glitter, and these weird bits of acrylic, and that there's something oddball about the whole thing too. Mine, not not anyone else's, but.
A bunch of my artist friends are involved with Scholar's Rocks, these ancient collected stones that the Chinese placed in their homes and in their studios for contemplation. They're great information for those of us who were raised on Henry Moore and ARP and study of abstract form in space. They're full of energy, enthusiasm for movement. I even think John Chamberlain, you know, the way that he crushed and left color and form, and yet very much manipulated those accidents that he first started to discover as accidents, and then he became so enthralled with it became purposeful constructions. I love that intersection of purpose and accident and how those things play out in a Scholar's Rock. What would it be like to put a bunch of people whose work addressing these same themes in a room with traditional Scholar's Rocks? I'm a great enthusiast for wood. I love wood, and I think the way that it's a living thing that I manipulate and work with, respond to. And my wood pieces, even though I kind of jump off of the idea of Scholar's Rocks, they're still wood, and I don't completely lose their wood identity, but I'm also playing with the idea of rock and how rocks and wood have a natural resemblance. I'm enthused by the synergy of natural forms that I know so well, mountains and trees and animal shapes and musculature, and how all those things meld in a perfect existence that we have in this world, a beautiful, beautiful world. Developing the concept for this show has been really interesting. It's been a long period of study and work. With Donna Dodson, we organized a talk about the zodiac and scholars' rocks. The invited guests were Kemin Hugh and Al Miner. Kemin Hugh, who is so enthralled with the spirit of the stone and her feelings for an individual stone. And then we saw Al Miner, who took the intellectual approach of scholars' rocks as perhaps the original ready-made, where we find an object and we elevate it to art status.
Well, I'm making both 2- and 3-dimensional work, and it's not really about pigeonholing the work, but about opening it up and, you know, asking a whole lot of questions about what a painting might be. I think they're both. They're sculptural paintings to me. I think to a more, you know, traditional viewer, they are sculpture. And I wanted to put my work in that context very deliberately because I was really unsatisfied with the dialogue that went along with abstract painting. I mean, I do abstract painting, but I've taken it like in my own sort of direction. I respect the tradition of painting that I'm working in. I respect all those Hudson River landscape painters. But I also come from the Hudson River Valley and feel like, well, I don't have to make those kinds of paintings. You know, my work is more about just totally sublime aspects of the landscape. But it is always about the landscape for me. But to me, they are paintings because that's the vocabulary that I have in my head. I'm thinking about things like color relationships primarily. And I talk about, you know, the way that I make these, the process for making them is almost taking a walk in the woods. I set off and I know what my intention is, but I'm not really sure what's going to happen along the way. And because I'm working within molds that I create, and I build these molds sort of as the piece grows, yeah, it really just becomes about putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that inevitably I'll get to some place that's exciting or surprising to me. I want to surprise myself. It's always a what if kind of question for me. It's about curiosity. This is what I love about the concept of the scholars' rocks, because they were these, they were sort of aids for intellectual inquiry. They weren't really about proving anything, they were more about inspiring the mind.
So when I go to a place, one of my first instincts is go and see where are the rocks here. It's an inspiration to connect with the landscape immediately. When I pick the rock, I bring it to the studio, and then many of them, they suggest me shapes like landscapes, exact connection with the rocks that I work in my studio. I think that is the installation of my stones. It could be in different shapes, like a line or a circle or a different shapes. When I think that I put one rock and then the other rock is telling me, okay, I'm going next. That's really the way that I work. I have all the stones individually worked and paint, and then the arrangement comes naturally in that way, spontaneously. I see a true connection between my stones and the scholar stones. In many of the rocks that I collect, they have that kind of feeling and holes, and also the shapes. And all, when I say primarily, I will go back more, not only the shape, but also the content. That is an ancient civilization that connects with the ancient civilization that I work. The name is Selknam, Aborigines from Patagonia, And I'm inspired by the design that they use to paint their bodies. So the colors and the designs are related with this ancient civilization. I see a connection always into the past with the present. That's why my fascination to bring the past to a contemporary meditation and exhibition. I think that humans are connected and we are a consequence of the past. And we can answer many questions about a contemporary life by looking into the past.